Hi, everybody, and welcome to AXA Arctic Live. My name is Jamie from Encounter EDU, and I will be your host for today, taking you through this live investigation looking at what happens if the Arctic melts. And you can see in this virtual Arctic behind me a few icebergs, and then further back, some glaciers. Now, AXA Arctic Live is a joint science and education program. We are based out of Ny-Ålesund, and that is on an island called Svalbard. And I've just got my little globe here, which I'll bring in front of the camera just to show you where that is. So we're on this island called Svalbard, and that is up here, halfway between the top of Norway and the North Pole. You can see other countries around. If I turn this around a bit, we've got Greenland here, Iceland, coming down to the UK, Spain, France, those types of places. And when we're in Ny-Ålesund, it's a former mining settlement that over the past 50 years has transformed into the northernmost science community in the world. And there are stations, research stations from all sorts of different countries. So we have the Norwegians, the French, the Germans, Italians, Dutch, British, where we're based. We've got Indians, Chinese, and a host of others up here finding out what's happening in the Arctic. For Arctic Live, we're looking at two things in terms of the science. We're looking at ocean acidification. So that's how carbon dioxide in the atmosphere absorbed into the ocean changes its chemistry. We're also looking at marine plastics. So are there plastics in the waters up here? And next week, we'll be talking to some of the science team about what they might have found out so far and what they're still thinking about. So do tune in for those science sessions next week. The other thing that we do is this live education outreach, sharing this amazing and fragile environment with you at home and at school. So with this live lesson, we're going to do a few things. We're going to look at some basics about ice, and we're going to learn a little bit about the different types of ice. We're then going to do a live investigation. Don't worry if you don't have time to do this live with us. There's always the opportunity to do it afterwards, and with all the ice and water, it might be best to save this one up for the kitchen. And last but by no means least, we've got the Q&A section of this live lesson. We've had some great questions submitted in advance, and also we've got the live chat. Now, the live chat that you can see over here, that is a live classroom. So please do put in your shout outs to where you're watching from and any questions or comments as we go along. And I can just check in to see. We've got some really lovely comments so far. But without further ado, I've got some very important messages. We've got schools from the UK, Spain, New Zealand, Poland, Ukraine, and Ireland watching this morning. And I have some special shout outs that have been sent through to us. We've got Elliot and Henry, who are from Market Deeping Community Primary School. Good morning, Elliot and Henry. We've got P6 at Dunblane Primary. Fantastic to have you all with us. We've got Oakfield Academy students watching. Good morning. We have a huge thank you to all the very hardworking Year 9 students, and they're at Greenhill School in Tenby, and that's from the science team. And your teachers and the science team at the school are really proud of the hard work and effort you're putting in very difficult circumstances. So fab to have you with us. Miss Kate and Miss Serena's third grade class from ASB Bilbao tuning in. Some of our kids have done climate change projects on this topic, and they've been very good ones too. And that's fantastic to have you with us, and looking forward to taking you through this lesson as well. And then we have Mrs. Van Roy's class from West Ayrton in New Zealand. They've been tuning in to all the lessons this week. It's been fab having you. So a big hi to all of them. So hi to all those tuning in from New Zealand. So the first section that we're going to go through is we're going to look at ice and different types of ice. So the first photo I'm going to show you on screen is a picture of the Arctic during the winter, well, at the end of the winter in March. And what you'll notice up in the Arctic, you'll see that it's an ocean surrounded by land. So at the bottom, you can see sort of Alaska poking up, then coming sort of clockwise around, you get to Russia, all the way around, past Svalbard, that little island where the sort of inlet of the ice is, and then round to the top of Greenland, and then the Canadian islands to the north there. But what you can see is that big frozen sea, the Arctic sea ice up there. Now, over the year, that amount of sea ice changes. So if we were to look at a photo during the summer or towards the end of the summer in September, when the amount of ice is lowest, we can see there's a rather large reduction. And the photo that you can see at the moment shows one of the lowest sea ice extents, and that was in 2012. So we've got this amount of sea ice which is large in the winter and then decreasing in the summer. And that's a seasonal variation that takes place every year. The only problem is that maximum is getting smaller and the minimum is getting smaller. But that seasonal variation has happened for a long time. If we just have a quick look at the Antarctic, we can see a classic picture that you might see in on an atlas or on a globe, this very classic shape of Antarctica. And we can see it's covered with ice, this land, this continent, and surrounded by ocean. Now, Antarctica also has sea ice. In fact, it is almost like it's doubling in size during the winter. So a photo that shows the sea ice will show that it's coming around the whole of the continent and increasing the size of Antarctica. And that again is happening on a seasonal basis. In the winter, large amounts of sea ice, in the summer, contracting in. And that brings us on to some important definitions about ice. We have different types of ice. So when we're looking at the ice on Antarctica and the ice up on the glacier behind me, that's ice formed on land. And the ice formed on land is created by snow falling over many thousands of years and forming these glaciers or ice sheets, these larger ice sheets on Greenland and Antarctica. In fact, 99% of all frozen fresh water on the planet is in the ice sheets on Greenland and the Antarctic. That's a huge amount. It's about 3/4 of all the fresh water on the planet frozen in to these two regions. And if you fly over the center of Svalbard, it is quite magnificent. You fly over these glacial areas, you fly over this landscape created over many thousands of years by falling snow, then being compacted into ice. When these glaciers start to flow from in the interior of Svalbard or from these huge ice sheets like we have in Antarctica and Greenland, they tend to come to the sea eventually. And here we can see in this photograph, this amazing glacier which is behind me at the moment, coming down to the sea. And you can see the crevassing there, the sort of jagged holes being made into the ice. Now, when the ice meets the sea, it forms another type of ice. You might be quite familiar with this. It's icebergs. So icebergs are formed by land ice coming down to the sea and breaking off. And they can be wonderful shapes, wonderful sizes, wonderful colors. The wonderful blues that have been seeing behind me show that. And if we come to thinking about those pictures I showed beforehand, where we're seeing the sea ice forming in the summer, decreasing in the summer, forming in the winter, that's not created by lots of icebergs. That's created by the sea freezing and then thawing. So ice formed in the sea is the sea freezing, and this happens on a seasonal basis. Now, we need quite cold temperatures for that to happen. It's about between minus 1.6 and 1.8 degrees Celsius, and that's because the seawater has salt in it, and salt lowers the freezing point of water. So when we're looking at the sea ice in the Antarctic, it's about a meter or so thick, 1 to 2 meters thick, because it tends to form just on an annual basis and then retreat back. In the Arctic, it's on average between probably about 2 meters thick. And that's because there is some old ice there, and all the sea ice doesn't disappear in the summer. The sea ice can actually get quite thick, up to sort of 5 or more meters. And that's what we call multi-year ice. So ice that doesn't melt completely in the summer, but comes back and grows every season, is added to that thick layer of ice. Now, this live lesson is all about what happens if that ice melts in the Arctic and in the Antarctic. And what we're going to do is a little investigation and have a mini Arctic sea ice investigation and a mini Antarctic land ice investigation. What you'll need for this is a few things. You'll need 2 plastic or glass containers, and these are going to hold your oceans. You'll need 2 jars, cans, or something else. If you are using an empty, smaller jar, make sure you fill it with water so it sinks and doesn't bob about in your ocean. I'm then going to place that in here. And just off screen, I'm going to add some water to it. Just because if I add it on screen, I've got balance doing a whole lot of things and probably spill water on my computer. So this is going to be my Arctic, and you'll see that I've put some water in here. I'm now going to add some ice to the sea. I'm not going to hold it up too much because I'm going to just tip the ice everywhere. But you can see in here little bits of ice that I have. I'm just going to put some sea ice into my sea, drop those in here. If I were up in the real Arctic rather than the virtual Arctic, what I'd be doing is I would have gone down to the beach this morning and picked up an iceberg, and I'd chop little bits of iceberg up and put those in my experiments. But we're just going to keep on dropping these ones in. Here we are. Put that down and hold this up to show you. So you can see there, I've got my ice in the sea. I would like to observe change over time. So I'm going to take a marker pen. I'm going to mark the sea level here. I think that's a bit fairly straight. There we go. You can see that line on there. I'm going to see by the end of today's lesson what will happen if all that ice melts in the sea, in the Arctic Ocean. This I'm going to have as Antarctica. I'm going to balance the Antarctic ice sheet on here. I'll try and hold it up. It might be quite tricky. So you can see that my ice is on top of the land. I'm balancing ice pens and everything else. I've marked up on there. I don't want to get it too high for you because I just worry that ice is going to fall down. I'm going to leave those two to melt, and we're going to see how the sea level might rise if the ice on the land melts in the Antarctic and the ice in the sea melts in the Arctic. Scientists might come up with a prediction or a hypothesis about what they think might happen. So, if you're doing this at home at the moment, then think about what might happen, your prediction or your hypothesis. Now we're going to go over to the live chat section in just a bit, but we've got some great questions that have come through. So the questions that have come through, the first question is from West Ayrton School, and they would like to know, would the animals in the Arctic be able to adapt to a new habitat if the Arctic began to warm? It's a really great question. What happens to the animals in a warming Arctic? Now, there are 2 or 3 impacts that might happen. First of all, you might see a loss of what we call habitat. So if the Arctic warms, there's probably going to be less sea ice. So animals that rely on sea ice for parts of their life cycle, for instance, giving birth with seals, or for hunting for polar bears, might be affected if there is less of that available. A warming ocean might also mean that animals that live further south might be able to come north as with the warmer waters and start to compete with the animals that live in the Arctic. So there'll be competition for the resources up there. And last, you might find that animals like sea stars, starfish, and sea urchins might have less food coming from algae forming on the bottom of sea ice. So certainly a warming Arctic will place a lot of pressure on different living things for different reasons. And so it's important that we do as much as possible to conserve the Arctic as it is. So the next question, and that's again from West Ayrton School, is how much will the sea level rise if the Arctic melts? Well, I'm not going to give away what's going to happen quite here, but I'm just going to let you know that if the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet were to melt, we would see sea level rises of, I think it's about 70 meters. So we'll see sort of about a tenth of that from Greenland and about 90% from the Antarctic. So huge sea level rises if all the ice in Antarctica and all the ice in Greenland were to melt. From Green Hill School, we've got, if climate change is impacting the global temperature, is it possible that we can reverse it so we can prevent the Arctic melting, or is it too late? Well, certainly reversing is not quite where we are at the moment in terms of global targets. We're looking at keeping emissions, getting to net zero emissions. Reversing it will take even longer. So the international community is really trying to get us down to not adding any more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere and to keep warming levels as they are. We may want to try and stretch them to see if we can get into negative emissions so that we're taking out more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than we're putting into it. And one of the things I think most people can agree on is the need at the moment for more trees. People calling for the planting of 1 billion trees. But there are lots of different ways that we're looking at this. First of all, is reducing the amount of carbon that we put into the atmosphere, and then looking at what's called carbon capture and storage. How can we take out carbon dioxide that is already in the atmosphere? It's a really great question. Marco from Bilbao, hi Marco, would like to know, if all the Arctic ice melts, will polar bears disappear? Marco, probably not. They're quite an adaptable species, and even with the reduced sea ice in Svalbard, we're seeing that they're changing their feeding habits and getting food from other sources that does not require hunting on sea ice. But it will definitely place pressure on those populations of polar bears. The population in Svalbard has really rebounded since the 1970s, since the ban on hunting up here. And so what we don't quite know, but what we're seeing is, if there's less food available to go around, certainly that's going to place a pressure on polar bears. At the moment, perhaps not their numbers, maybe their size, but this is something that scientists are very concerned with. Marco again, who lives on the coast, will all beaches and coastal towns like Gexo, where I live, disappear? It's a really great question. At the moment, what we're seeing is sea level rise of about 3 millimeters a year. Earlier, we saw that was being driven by what we call thermal expansion. So there are two main ways in which the sea level is currently rising. And we're talking about global average sea level. The sea level changes in different ways in different parts of the world, because the ocean isn't just a flat, big swimming pool. It is a wibbly wobbly, massive water, which has different heights and different behaviors in different places. And also the land can behave in different ways. But we have basically thermal expansion. So if you warm up the ocean, it will get bigger. So if we warm a liquid, it gets bigger. And the second contribution to sea level rise is melting ice. And we're going to see what kind of ice that might be in just a bit. So will you get flooded? Perhaps. And it really comes down to our choices that we make. So if we look at the current predictions for the end of the century, they vary a lot. They vary anything from just a couple of feet of sea level rise all the way up to 10 or more feet. And it's not just the sea level rising, it's just that allows more flooding, more storm surges, and that kind of thing. How much will the sea level rise between now and the end of the century? Well, that's really up to us. It's being driven a lot by climate change and those two factors, the warming of the oceans and this expansion, and the melting of ice. Marco would also like to know, will there be less oxygen because of flooded trees dying? Marco, I think what's important for you to look at are the 3 Ps of futures thinking. And it's important because what we're doing is looking into the future here. And the 3 Ps are probable, possible, and preferable. What's the probable future? What's a possible future? And what's a preferred future? And if we all work together to create a preferred future, then we will see some of these negative impacts that you're talking about here on the questions. Those will be lessened. So important when we're looking at this, nothing is set in stone, and we can still take action to lessen the impacts of climate change. We've now got a series of questions from Cransley School. And Alex, I think probably that your teacher is looking at what can we do to reduce our everyday impact. It's a really great question and applicable to all those watching. There's three things to think about and then an extra bonus. So the three things to think about are what you eat, how you travel, and how you live. And these aren't just personal changes that we can make, but we can also look for these changes through governments to be wider global changes. So, first of all, looking at how you eat, how can you have a lower carbon diet? And I will ask Ellie in just a moment, who's our live producer, who has a very wonderful low carbon diet, to share her thoughts and her behaviors on that. Up here in the Arctic, we have a canteen that really caters very well to vegan and vegetarian diets. The other thing you can do is think about how you can travel with less of an impact. And what we've seen during the pandemic, certainly where I live in London, is more and more people taking to bicycles, avoiding public transport. And that's going to reduce the impact on the environment in the long term as well. And I must say that taking the bicycles instead of public transport, but still observing the lockdown, and just to make sure that message gets out, that that's a choice where people have to leave their homes and are choosing different forms of transport. And last but by no means least is how we live. How much do we actually need? How much consumerism can the planet support? Really important decisions to make. So I think I'm just going to check to see whether Ellie is ready to talk about her planet-friendly diet. Hi, Ellie.
Hi everybody. Yes, so I about 5 years ago made an environmental change to my diet, which was to go plant-based. It's sometimes known as vegan. There are a few differences between plant-based for environmental reasons and vegan for some other reasons. But essentially, I cut out all of the major foods that have very, very high carbon footprints, i.e., that have a big impact environmentally. I did that for environmental reasons because I wanted to demonstrate I wanted to for my behavior to match the messaging that I was saying about being a good environmentalist and everybody doing their part, everybody doing their small thing that they can do to help save the planet. And I thought, what better way to do that than to show everybody? And I have to say, my diet has been so varied, so yummy, so interesting. I've learned a lot about cooking different vegetables and lentils and seeds that I never thought about. And in the Arctic, the vegan diet is absolutely yummy. So I actually feel like I've sort of stumbled on a really exciting secret of yummy food. And I definitely encourage people to look into the benefits of a plant-based diet for your health and for the environment.
Ellie, thank you so much. And I think it's very, very true that we can sense there's a sense of potential lack when people might move to a vegan diet. I'm going to miss out on all these things. But thank you for pointing out that, in fact, you'll probably discover even more things to enjoy on a food basis, moving to a vegan diet and exploring the creativity almost that imposes at first, but that you can enjoy later on.
Absolutely. And it's worth just saying as well that you don't need to go 100% vegan, plant-based straight away. You don't need to be really strict on yourself straight away, because if you're not currently plant-based, it is a bit tricky sometimes to find those alternatives and get used to a different diet. So you can do something called meat-free Mondays,
Okay.
where one day a week you cut out meat, or you could go dairy-free first and then gradually reduce and gradually shift across. So it's not quite such a shock to your kind of shopping system and your cooking system. But good luck, everybody.
Ellie, thank you so much. We've got a couple more of the pre-submitted questions. I was just checking to see the live chat there as well to see what questions are coming through there. We've got from Bilbao, we've got what will happen if polar bears become extinct. We covered this a bit when we looked at Arctic food chains. So if the apex predator, the polar bear, becomes extinct, the animals that it eats, such as seals, their populations might increase, which means that what they eat will decrease, the Arctic cod. You might also find there's an increase in other predators, so orca, killer whales, might increase their populations as well. But apex predators play an incredibly important role in ecosystems to keep balance really in an ecosystem. So if polar bears were to go, it would create an imbalance in the food webs and the different living things up here in the Arctic. And we've got a question coming through from Dunblane Primary. What is summer like in the Arctic and how warm does it get here? Well, certainly we're in spring at the moment. In the summer, we'll get super toasty temperatures up into sort of 5-6 degrees, perhaps even more at these times. And if you're out of the wind and in the sun, you can be just in a shirt or a t-shirt and really enjoying the weather up here. Definitely if there's a wind up or if you're in the shade, it still feels pretty chilly. Today, the temperature's not too bad, but next week we're seeing them come down to the minus sort of 8s, minus 10s, minus sort of 15s over next week. So time to get some more togs on so we don't get too cold out on the boat. Out on the boat, when we're doing our sampling, it can get really quite chilly. We had a day down to minus 20, the wind blowing and icebergs crashing around as well. But there's a lovely question here from Dunblane. What would happen to the climate of planet Earth if the Arctic melted? And this brings us on to a very important term called albedo. And there's an albedo investigation that we have on the Encounter EDU website to explore this. Albedo refers to the whiteness. It's from the Latin for white. And as you saw in that picture, when the Arctic is covered in ice, it's like a big white mirror, and that's reflecting heat back up into the atmosphere. If all that whiteness were to melt, then you've got dark ocean, and that dark ocean absorbing more heat energy and then making the warming happen faster. So if there's a decrease in albedo, a decrease in the whiteness of the Arctic, that will start to make warming happen faster. And that's what we call a positive feedback loop. So the more warming there is, the less reflection there is from the ice, the faster the warming gets, the less reflection there is. So that's something that scientists are concerned about. They're also concerned about that in terms of making the Greenland ice sheet melt faster. And people are looking at the extent to which pollution, so black soot, can actually come onto the glaciers here and in other places and make that melting happen faster. Really, really great, great question. So just coming down through to the questions are being, I'm just scrolling down through the live chat. And we have here from Poland, this is a question from Stefan. In Poland, we didn't have a winter this year. Is it an impact of a global warming or just unusual jet stream activity? Stefan, it's really important to distinguish between climate and weather. So this is something often we see confused in the debates. We had a really warm winter, we had a really cold winter, we had this, we had that. So most climate graphs you will see are a bit wiggly or quite wiggly. And this is because of the natural variation we have. Certainly in the UK, and I think probably in Poland, you get a lot of variation between the weather in the summer and in the winter. You get a lot of variation between winters. And this is part of the natural variation, natural changes we have. What we're looking at is in that wiggle, is there a trend? If we take a 30-year average, can we see a difference over time? So even if you had a really cold winter one year, or we had a really warm winter one year, is that just a one-off, or is it part of an overall trend changing gradually over time? So I'm not sure specifically, Stefan, what happened with the Polish winter this year, but just really important to look at trends, maybe a 30-year average, rather than changes from year to year, because that will be influenced by natural variation. In terms of jet stream, we are seeing a melting Arctic influence jet stream activity, and that's one other change that we're seeing from changes in the Arctic, and how that might cause more instability and different weather systems over Europe and North America. We have a question through from Isaac, who's talking about, will a melting Arctic affect the food chain? Isaac, it's a really great question. We've covered it a little bit. If a habitat for an animal, if its habitat changes, so in this case, melting, that will affect potentially its ability to get food. Now, one of the really sort of obvious but sort of lesser known impacts of melting ice is that we have algae growing on the underneath of sea ice, and sometimes it exudes excess sugar, and sometimes it falls down when it's dead, and it falls to the bottom of the ocean. And then we have bottom feeders like sea stars, starfish, and sea urchins that rely on that falling down. If we didn't have the sea ice, then we wouldn't have those algal communities there, perhaps different ones, but not the same ones. So they might be affected on the bottom of the ocean. So research going into that. We have from Stockport saying, would people colonize a melted Arctic? That's a really great question. I think colonization, maybe not quite the right word, but exploitation is something I think we should be concerned about. There are a lot of mineral and fossil fuel reserves in the Arctic, and they could become more accessible to companies looking to exploit them if the Arctic melted. Thankfully, we've seen a number of companies withdraw from trying to drill for oil in the Arctic over the past few years, mainly because it was just too difficult to operate in this very, very difficult region. But if that were to change in the future, they might come back. And legislation or coming together as a world to say we don't want commercial exploitation in the Arctic is something that I feel very strongly about. In the Antarctic, we have the Madrid Protocol, which bans commercial and military activity in Antarctica. That's coming up for review in 2041. And again, trying to see if we can keep these wonderful pristine polar regions free of commercial exploitation. So great question there from Stockport. What is melting faster, the Arctic or the Antarctic? So we'll talk about what we know in terms of melting. One of the things to look up online, certainly that's been in the news a lot at the moment, is what's happening to the Thwaites Glacier. Okay, so if we can get that THWAITES glacier. Antarctica is melting quite unevenly. It's not just one big blob of ice. It's actually split into two sort of regions. So we've got West Antarctica and East Antarctic ice sheets. We're also seeing that if you can imagine a map of Antarctica, you've got that little pointy bit going up towards the bottom of Argentina and Chile. That's the Antarctic Peninsula, and that's being affected by melting faster because it's further north. So the melting that we're seeing in Antarctica is quite uneven, but it is happening. Some estimates that up to 2.5 millimeters of the sea level rise that we're seeing is coming from the melting of Antarctica. In the Arctic, with the Greenland ice sheet, there are strong evidence bases and data showing that the melt on Greenland is accelerating at an alarming rate. So I would say, from what I know, that we're seeing different melting in different places, but certainly in the Arctic, the acceleration of melt on the Greenland ice sheet is something of great concern to the science community and should be to us all. Another from Isaac's, do icebergs mean that the ice is melting too much? Isaac, it's a great question. Icebergs have come and over the centuries, millennia, ice has broken off when glaciers meet the sea, when ice sheets meet the sea. So no, it is not a evidence that the ice is melting too much. What we see is that the snow collects, compacts, and then flows down towards the sea. If we see an acceleration of that movement because of melting, then we'll see more icebergs potentially. In fact, that way, if you sail down the fjord, is the Ostrobrogerbyen, one of the glaciers. And we were abseiling down inside the middle of that to see if melt was potentially lubricating, so making it faster to slip beneath the rock underneath, and the ice on top speeding the glacier into the sea. So we've just got a few minutes left. So I'm going to come back to my mini oceans, being some amazing questions coming through. And first of all, I'm going to come to my mini Arctic Ocean with this as sea ice and see whether we can see about the sea level rise change there. And you can see the lovely Baileys, but more importantly, you can see there has been little or no change. Let's hold it up again. Little or no change in the sea level rise. And that is because the sea ice is made from the sea freezing. And so when it melts again, it is just the sea returning to its natural state. So it's just the sea freezing and refreezing. So if it melts, it's not going to cause sea level to rise. We have now the Antarctic ice sheet. I'm just going to hold this like this and turn it round. And so we have the Antarctic ice sheet. We can see there that if land ice were to melt, that we are seeing sea level rise. As I mentioned before, potentially 65, 70 meters of sea level rise if the entire Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets were to melt. So just a little investigation to look at the impacts of melting of different types of ice. I'm just going to see if we've got last couple of questions, and maybe one more question before, very sadly, it's time to say goodbye. If all the ice melts in the Arctic, will other animals be affected, not just animals in the Arctic? It's a really interesting question. What we have if the ice melts in the Arctic is our species moving further north, so that can affect everywhere. If there's a overall movement of species of going north. I think that the other thing is how the melting of sea ice, and this is quite a complex issue to get into a very small piece, but the melting of sea ice can affect the Gulf Stream. And so if the Gulf Stream is affected, that's the ocean current that warms northwestern Europe, then it can start to put an impact on the animals that live in the northwestern Europe as well as those in the Arctic. Some really, really great questions coming through. Thank you so much. We do have another version of this. We've got a second sea level rise investigation. What happens if the Arctic melts session later on today for those in North America. And then next week, we have a series of science talks, both from our Arctic Live science team. And we've got researchers doing lessons in German and in French next week. So do tune into those. But for those of you who are going to enjoy the weekend now, it's been wonderful having you. Thank you so much for being part of AXA Arctic Live. Thank you, Ellie, for sharing those great insights into a planet saving diet, and look forward to seeing you all next week back with AXA Arctic Live. For now, it's bye-bye. Bye-bye.